Hello, Sweki. My name is Thomas Schaupp and I work as a dramaturg and curator. Over the past years, I've had the chance to spend time in Vilnius and Kaunas giving workshops and mentoring, so it feels really meaningful for me to be part of this congress. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you in person. When you hear this, I'm on a journey that is probably once in a lifetime, traveling with my 80-year-old grandmother, which makes it all the more special, of course. I'm therefore really glad to be able to join you, at least in this way, and I wish you all a wonderful platform and an inspiring festival. I would like to begin with a simple observation. In the current political climate, and especially in Europe, visibility has become a value. Alongside visibility, another value has become central: urgency. We expect artists to respond, institutions to position themselves, and works to be legible in relation to political events. And, of course, we expect this to happen quickly. Urgency is often understood as a sign of relevance, sometimes even as proof of it. What interests me here, however, is not urgency as a feeling, but urgency as a condition. Urgency is rarely neutral. It shapes how work is produced, how it is perceived, and how responsibility is distributed. We often assume that more visibility and more urgency also mean more responsibility. But this is precisely the assumption I would like to question. My perspective is a dramaturgical one, not dramaturgy as a supportive function, but as a practice of organizing conditions, a way of asking what becomes visible, what remains protected, and who decides. I will not propose solutions. Instead, I want to look more closely at the conditions under which we are currently asked to act, to decide, and to take positions. More specifically, I want to unfold a relation between urgency, visibility, and empathy, and to approach these through a tension between exposure and shelter. This tension does not come from theory, but from practice, from working across different contexts where the same questions return in different forms. When is visibility necessary, and when does it become a demand? And what needs to be protected in order for work to exist at all? Exposure is often framed as positive, associated with relevance, visibility, and participation. But exposure is not only about showing, it is also about placing something under a certain light, about how something becomes readable for whom and under which expectations. Visibility does not simply reveal work, it actively shapes how that work is perceived, what counts as meaningful, convincing, or finished. Shelter, on the other hand, is often misunderstood as withdrawal or avoidance. Yet, this opposition between shelter and exposure is too simple. Exposure is never neutral, it always has a cost. The question is, who carries that cost? In this sense, urgency is not only a response to crisis, it can also become a requirement to be visible, articulate, and immediate. And like all requirements, it is not experienced equally. More importantly, urgency does not mean the same thing everywhere. In Berlin, urgency often is described as lacking. There is time, yes, infrastructure and space for production. Yet, work sometimes circulates within or without actually being exposed to a truly critical context. Urgency becomes diffuse or displaced. The question shifts from what is at stake in showing a work to how it positions itself within an already existing discourse. In this sense, a certain form of urgency might actually be missing. Not urgency as speed, but urgency as necessity. The necessity to ask, why this work? Why now? And why for this audience? I want to briefly acknowledge that in my own practice, I usually try to avoid why questions, replacing them with what questions. What does this work do? What does it produce? And what does it make possible? Because what moves us from justification into action? Here, however, I deliberately stay with why, because it continues to structure how work is evaluated, legitimized, and made accountable, revealing the expectations that shape the field, our field. In Ukraine, the situation is very different again. Urgency is immediate and undeniable. Work emerges directly from lived reality, from war, from displacement, and from survival. Yet, when this work enters international contexts, it is often read through expectations of artistic form, composition, or aesthetic innovation. Expectations shaped by Western perspectives on what counts as strong or interesting. And that raises another question. What happens when urgency is present but does not align with dominant aesthetic expectations? Urgency is not only unevenly distributed, it is also unevenly recognized. What counts as urgent depends on who is looking and from where. This brings us back to visibility. Visibility is not only about being seen, but about being seen in a particular way. To become visible often means to become legible within existing frameworks, and this legibility, of course, can be limiting. It can simplify contexts, reduce complexity, and translate work into narratives that are easier to receive. Visibility therefore produces not only recognition, but also alignment, and sometimes, of course, misunderstanding. These dynamics become especially concrete in moments of decision making. A programmer, for example, deciding whether to invite an artist from a crisis context is not only asking whether the work is strong, but also what it means not to invite it. What responsibility is involved in making it visible or not? Urgency is already present in this moment, not as a feeling, but as pressure. Pressure within the decision itself. And this pressure is not equally shared. There is no neutral position. Both inviting and not inviting are decisions, and both have consequences. Over time, these decisions become increasingly complex. In the early phase of a crisis, the Ukraine war, for example, institutions often make clear choices to give visibility and create platforms for Ukrainian artists. But as time passes, questions of sustainability, audience engagement, and artistic development emerge. The same decisions are no longer read only as acts of solidarity, but also as programming choices, which can lead to difficult situations. Not inviting may be perceived as withdrawal of support, while inviting may be seen as instrumentalizing a context. These decisions are, of course, further shaped by political influence. In recent years, cultural institutions have faced increasing pressure to position themselves. In Berlin, for example, debates around anti-Semitism, particularly in relation to positions on Israel and Palestine, and shaped by political attempts to define and regulate these positions, have directly affected programming, making visibility politically charged. Works are included or excluded. Invitations are reconsidered. And these decisions carry risks for institutions and individuals alike. In Lithuania, similar dynamics have unfolded, particularly in 2025, when large parts of the cultural field mobilized in response to political decisions affecting the Ministry of Culture, including the appointment of a right-wing nationalist politician to a key position. In Vilnius, where we are gathering in one way or another, these questions are shaped by geopolitical proximity, historical memory, and an acute awareness of how quickly conditions can shift. In such contexts, roles change. Cultural institutions no longer simply present work, they become political actors. Visibility becomes a political position, and shelter can become a collective act, a way of protecting the field itself. Speaking about exposure and shelter, therefore, also means speaking about power. The power to decide what becomes visible, to define what is acceptable, and to frame artistic work within political narratives. Visibility produces not only recognition, but also attention, legitimacy, and, of course, often funding. This raises the question of who benefits from exposure and who becomes visible primarily to sustain the relevance of institutions or discourses. Exposure can, in this sense, function as a form of extraction. If that is the case, the question is not only how we operate within these conditions, but how we might shift them, not necessarily through large gestures, but through small decisions, delaying visibility, protecting processes, refusing certain framings, or creating contexts in which work does not need to justify itself immediately. These gestures may seem minor, but they can redistribute how exposure and shelter are organized. Within this situation, empathy plays a crucial role. Empathy is often understood as a positive quality, a sign of openness, of care, and of connection. And I have worked with it myself as a practice of feeling deeply as an act of resistance. Yet, empathy also needs to be examined critically. In the current cultural field, it has shifted from an ethical or artistic capacity to a professional expectation. Yes, we are expected not only to feel, but to show that we feel. To be recognized, it is often no longer enough to present work. One is expected to demonstrate an emotional and personal relation to the world. This expectation is not equally distributed. For some, empathy is a resource. For others, it becomes a demand. A demand to expose oneself, to share personal realities, and to be legible through experience. In this sense, empathy can become a condition for participation. It does not only connect, it also selects and sometimes extracts. This all, it brings us back to the central tension. Both exposure and shelter require responsibility. Responsibility in how we create visibility and how we create protection. The question may therefore not be what we want from art, but what we ask from art and from whom. I would like to end with a series of questions, not as conclusions, but as positions that are not easy to hold. So, should crisis justify increased visibility even when other criteria are not fully met? Or is presenting work from politically affected regions an act of solidarity or an act of programming? Should artists be given visibility quickly, even if their work is not ready? Is it ever ready? Can choosing not to show something be a responsible curatorial decision? Has empathy become part of the job? And can visibility become a form of exploitation? Who should decide whether a work is exposed, artists or institutions? Do audiences expect political clarity, and should institutions provide it? And finally, is not taking a position also a political position? What we are about to do now is to take positions, to agree, to disagree, or to remain uncertain. But these positions are not neutral. Each decision is also a decision about exposure and shelter, about what we are willing to make visible, what we choose to protect, and perhaps also what we are not yet ready to decide. Thank you. Adieu.